every boy, every growing boy, and presumably every growing girl would like to be a wizard and would like to make magic happen.
Hey CNFers, you know what to do. Discover your story with Bay Path University's fully online MFA in creative non-fiction writing. Faculty have a true passion for their work. Shines through with every comment, edit, and reading assignment. The instructors are available to answer all your questions, and their years of experience as writers and teachers have made for an unbeatable experience. Head over to baypath.edu/MFA for more information. What do you say, CNFers? Want to get after it? Let's do this. Yes. All right, we've got Alexander Norman on the show today for episode 191. He wrote a thorough biography of the Dalai Lama. He's known the Dalai Lama for something like 30 years. I mean, we'll get into that. Title of the book, of course, is The Dalai Lama, An Extraordinary Life. It is published by Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. That's how we pronounce it. That's how we do this. By the way, I'm Brendan O'Mara. Hey. And this is the Creative Nonfiction Podcast, CNF Pod, if you're in the know. The show where I talk to badass writers and filmmakers. Sometimes we try to get them about the craft of telling true stories. I tell you, it's been a whirlwind of a week. How are you? You writing the thing? You rewriting the thing? You giving up? Don't give up. I should tell you that this coming Sunday, after this CNF Friday, is March 1st. First of the month. You know what that means, or do you? It means my newsletter goes out. Lots of fun things that I think are of service to you and your writing journey. So head over to BrendanO'Mara.com. Hey. Once a month, no spam. As far as I can tell, you can't beat it. So get this. We adopted a dog. Yep. It's almost been 2 years since our beloved Smarty passed away, and 3 years since our equally beloved Jackie passed, and we weren't quite ready. Every time it was just comparing, we didn't want to get into the game of feeling like we were replacing the older guys with a new one, and it just never felt right. It took a long time for us to mourn those guys because those were our boys. That was like our first family, and then when they died, it's like kind of the family broke a bit. And Melanie and I are cool, of course, but it was just like, those two guys, they were it. And so it took a long time. It definitely did. And so we something clicked, and we were ready to start looking at adopting a dog, hopefully two, but one for starters. I think we were in some ways also like tired of some of the self-destructive behaviors that we were routinely into. Speaking for myself, certainly not the missus, but some excessive drinking and eating, stuff that we gladly put aside when we're caring for another critter. Sometimes you don't know where to direct that energy, and sometimes it goes with, the couple we met. One was definitely male averse, so definitely came from some abusive background there, so that probably wasn't going to happen. But it was like sad to see all these other dogs barking. They're all scared, and then it was dredging up feelings of our dogs that had passed away too, so it was like pretty heavy. At least Oregon's a no-kill state, but still, it was still kind of tough to be there. That was Sunday, and all these pups were abandoned one way or another, and it's bullshit, but that's why we're passionate about adopting, right? So many of the dogs are in the 1 to 2 year range, which makes me think that people just get tired of them after they're no longer puppies. It's my theory. It just made me mad. But in any case, so we went back on Tuesday because we were clued in that there were some other dogs that would kind of meet and resonate with our kind of lifestyle. Hiking, running, lots of walking, weekend warrior type stuff. So we go back. And we met with one really cool dog named Radar, but he had a hold on him. already, and he was really, really excited and young and really rambunctious, and it was cool, and he definitely would have been fun to take home, but he was going to be adopted. So, but then the young woman who, brought him out, like, oh, we got this other dog who was just surrendered today, and he's like super sweet, and you should, you could check him out if you want. And we're like, yeah, sure, of course, we'll meet him. So he lopes in, and he's kind of clumsy. He's kind of looks like a very small Great Dane. He's still a big dog, but kind of clumsy. And we pet him for about 10 minutes. He was a little aloof, and it was like, but then after a while, he just laid down at my feet and rolled over and let me rub his belly, and like that did it. I was like, all right, that's done. I went down on the ground with him and rubbed his belly for another 10 minutes, and it was, he was even falling asleep. So at that point, we put a deposit down and went to the store and bought him a ton of shit. What's his name, you're asking? Roy Peter Clark right now would be beating the shit out of me because he's always like, get the name of the dog, right? And his name is Hank. He's a Catahoula mix, something of a southern water dog. He's 5 years old, about 75 pounds. He's a big goofball, and his butt wags really hard when he sees you, and he's excited to see you. So we brought him to his forever home Wednesday night, and we haven't been able to stop thinking about him and playing with him and taking pictures of him and drawing him because I'm a weirdo like that. We're in love, and I think he loves us. So plenty of dog stuff over on my Instagram at Brendan O'Mara. Hey. I'll keep the dog stuff off the CNF pod feed maybe. But so yeah, how's that social media sabbatical treating you now? Hey, I got a nice new shiny review over on Apple Pods to read. If you leave a kind review, I'll be sure to read it on air. Means a lot for the show to get them. It really does. And I want to show my appreciation for you by giving the best of shout-outs here in the intro. This one from Sourdough the Biscuit, titled, Great Conversations. I found Brendan's podcast through his conversation with novelist Tim O'Brien. I appreciated Brendan's informed questions and how the talk between Tim and Brendan was natural and free-flowing. Subscribed, and looking forward to listening to more of Brendan's podcast conversations. Awesome. An even better name, Sourdough the Biscuit. That is freaking awesome. Thank you for the review. Like I said, they mean a ton for the packaging of the show. And, we're all in this mess together. So if we can support each other in any way possible, that's what I try to do. And by you submitting reviews of that kind, you are in turn supporting what we do here at CNF Pod HQ. Did you also know that registration for HippoCamp 2020 is open? There's no more early birds. Worms are gone, but there's still a way to save some dough. Visit hippocamp2020.hippocampusmagazine.com. It's going to test your typing skills. And use the promo code CNFPod2020 to get $40 off your fee. In fact, I'm going to use the promo code myself. Best money you'll spend on a conference this year. I promise you. Not throwing shade at other conferences, like one that might be coming up in a week or so. I'm not doing it. I'm not going to throw that shade. I'm not throwing that fastball, high chin music. I'm just saying, HippoCamp, do it. And also that reminds me, too, we all need editors, right? We all need editing. We all need accountability. And that's where I want to step in. If you've got an essay or a book that needs coaching, I'd be honored and thrilled to serve you in your work. Sometimes you just need someone in your corner, toweling you off. Cut me, Mick. You know what I mean? Something of that nature. Email me, brendan@brendanomera.com, and let's start a conversation because the world needs your work. We need you to show up, and I want to help. I want to help you show up, and I want to help you get the most out of your work. Ugh. I get out of breath sometimes, man. I don't know what that is. My mom will sometimes, she's like, I get out of breath when I talk. I'm like, well, you got to breathe, Mom. She's like, no, I have cancer. I'm like, you don't have cancer, Mom. How do you know? I'm 81. You've had a good, long life, Mom. It's okay. And anyway, I've got Alexander Norman hailing from the UK, so that's cool. I've had quite a few Brits on the show. Actually, it's kind of amazing. For whatever reason, I get a lot of pitches from the UK, and I love talking to them. I love speaking to them. They got a great way of talking. It's always nice to hear that accent in your ears. He's got some great insights into ghostwriting, finding voice in writing, and how after 30 years of writing, he's still finding the voice. Yeah, so it's ongoing. So that's pretty cool. And surrendering your own ego and your own voice to the story of others, so the story stands tall. It's good stuff. I hope you enjoy this chat with Alexander Norman. Ooh. How have you cultivated your writing practice in a place that's fairly, at least through my estimation, fairly remote?
Interesting question. Well, first of all, I would say that I've always been a bit of a vagrant, although I originally came from the Isle of Wight. I can't even say that I've really settled back here. I've kind of had a rather peripatetic existence, living in different parts of the Isle of Wight, different parts of Britain, and also different parts of Europe, and traveling a lot in the Indian subcontinent and indeed in the States as well. So I would say that some writers manage to settle in one place. I never have managed it.
And would you say that, writing in general as a practice and as a discipline, was it something that you were drawn to, or that you chose, or did writing in a sense kind of choose you?
Yeah, I think I'm in the Bernard Shaw camp here. Bernard Shaw, who said that he'd wanted to be an engine driver, a train driver. In fact, almost anything except being a writer, and I think I'm possibly cut from the same cloth. I think it finds you out. I think you find that you can't actually do anything else. That tends to be what happens, or at least that's what happened to me.
Do you have a moment where that kind of hit you over the head, a book or a series of books, or a writer, or a chance encounter with an author, and how that had the writing choosing you manifested itself?
Yeah, well, I can mention the title of the book. It was The Unbearable Lightness of Being by Milan Kundera, which I read when I was about 24, I should think, and it suddenly opened up a whole new vista of what literature could be. I had a fairly conventional upbringing, and I never really completed my education until I was much later than 24. I didn't actually go to university until I was in my 40s, having been in the meantime an army officer for 5 years and a journalist, a sort of jobbing journalist, for about 10 years. But it was that moment when you come across a work that completely explodes the notion of what literature is, that gave me a little bit of confidence to have a go on my own. But in a way, I suppose, as a writer, I've been 30 years trying to find a voice. And whether I do it in this book or not, I don't know. But I aspire one day to have a unique voice and to be able to tell a tale that nobody else could tell. And of course, different writers mean different things at different times. And I suppose I would cite other major influences as I'm particularly drawn to, for example, the writings of Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, who I'm afraid I've never read in French apart from The Little Prince. My French isn't good enough to manage all his work in the original language, but in translation. Amongst the British writers of the sort of genre, I suppose, that I work in, which you could call, which apart from biography is history, travel, and so forth. The sort of, perhaps I flatter myself, the literary end of those disciplines. I think the standout writer is James, later Jan Morris, who, like myself, was an army officer, a cavalry officer, as a young man, married, had 5 children, and became one of the early trans people. Wrote magnificently, both as a travel writer and as an historian. His Venice was one of the most remarkable, I think, travel books of the 20th century, and his History of the British Empire, the 3-volume Pax Britannica trilogy, is one of the best things, in my view, that's ever been written about that period in Britain's history. And the autobiography Conundrum is one of the most remarkable, it's quite a slight work, but it's challenging. But Morris, he and she, brings to history and brings to travel writing an elegance and a colour that I think was lacking, certainly in historical writing. I suppose Robert Byron is the other great travel writer that one could think of, who wrote about these, whose book, for example, First Russia, Then Tibet, gives an example of what I consider to be, great literary travel writing.
What would you say, or what would you attribute maybe the influence of having been an Army officer on the experience that you bring to the page as a writer?
That's a difficult question. I find it easier to answer the question, how's it influenced me in my relationship with the Dalai Lama and with my Tibetan friends? And the answer to that would be, I think that I was instantly recognizable. I was a type with which they were familiar, with which they'd grown familiar during the 30s and 40s and 50s. It's not well known that there was a British political mission in Tibet from the early 20s until 1947. And of course, the British influence in India, although it ended formally and officially in 1947 with independence, actually carried on much longer than that. Many of the Tibetan aristocracy who, of the Dalai Lama's generation and a bit younger, for example, his younger brother, many of his nephews and nieces, were educated educated in British private schools that were set up in India during the time of the Raj. So in that sense, to them, I think I was an instantly recognizable, I don't want to say cliche, but I looked something familiar. But how it's played out in my writing is a much more difficult question. Maybe it's been a constant effort to break out of that mindset, if you like. Mm-hmm. Although, I mean, the number of Army officers turned writer are quite extensive. I mean, Evelyn Waugh was himself a cavalry officer during the Second World War, and there are many others who experienced the discipline of the army. So as I think, I would say that it's, if anything, as a writer, indeed as a person, I suppose, in a way, I've been engaged in an effort to overthrow or to break out of or to get beyond what was, after all, in the experience of anybody who's done it. You're a young man, and it takes up, it's a very vivid part of one's life. If you do it for 5 years, as I did, from the age of 19 to 25 actually, it stamps you indelibly. There's no question about that. It colors your experience. It colors your entire life. Whatever you do, I think, between the ages, during your formative years, it's bound to have a massive and lasting effect.
It's what strikes me about that. Like Orwell comes to mind, Ernest Hemingway, and being young men stationed abroad, having some, armed experience, and it put them in contact with the world and other cultures. And so, in a sense, like as writers and artists, sometimes the struggle is like what to develop a rich enough palette from which to write from. And I think the military, it forces a different geography on you for sure, and puts you in touch with different people, and then gives you some experience from which to draw from.
I think that's true. I'd go so far as to say, it puts you in touch with different cultures, even if you don't even if you don't leave your own hometown in a sense, by which I mean you're forced to meet and deal and have commerce with people who you wouldn't ordinarily come across in your if you want to put it that way, station in life. I mean, if, as most British Army officers were, and to a lesser extent still are, you come from a relatively privileged, privately educated background, you're suddenly forced into close proximity with people who've come from very different and often very challenging backgrounds. If you're to retain your humanity, you have to learn to deal with and be real with and present yourself to people whose outlook on life may be very, very different, and somehow form with them a kind of community that through which, a community through which you can fare forth into the world, if you like, whether it be the world of armed combat or simply, I don't know, being in a barracks or something, or for that matter, traveling abroad as I did with some of my soldiers from time to time. So yeah, I think it forces you into situations, into unfamiliar situations, unfamiliar relationships, which are bound to have an effect on you later in life. And I certainly see that in my experience with my Tibetan friends. Here I'm confronting people with whom I've not much in common apart from my humanity. I have Tibetan friends whose life story, whose narrative has been so vastly different from mine that you could hardly imagine anything more disparate. And yet, through that common humanity and through the experience, the shared experience of being in a particular place at a particular time, there's a tremendous opportunity for mutual enrichment.
Something you said earlier about voice, and that's always the challenge as writers and filmmakers or whoever, to have that sort of unique vision. That it's a struggle and a challenge for sure, and it's sometimes a lifelong, career-long thing to really manifest. And some people, I think, want that voice right away, and it's very hard to come across, and sometimes very hard to pin down. So, what has been your struggle and your journey of finding your voice on the page, which, by all accounts, still feels ongoing for you?
It very much feels ongoing. The first book that I wrote was actually a collaborative work. It was the Dalai Lama's own autobiography. I was the ghostwriter. And that goes true for the second and third books that I did. In fact, I've ghostwritten 4 books, and I've only actually written 2 on my own account. I think that I was, in a way, I suppose when you're ghostwriting a book, you're trying to put yourself out of the picture as much as possible. You want it to be as faithful. You want to capture somebody else's voice and suppress your own to the maximum extent possible. Mm-hmm. And I was especially conscious of this, of course, writing the Dalai Lama's autobiography, because, you could argue that ghostwriting is an exercise in impersonation. I don't see it that way myself. I see it as an exercise in trying faithfully to represent or to give voice to another person, to another human being. But in a way, you could argue that the ghostwriter is somebody who doesn't have the confidence in his own voice, who doesn't have the maybe the courage, indeed, to speak in their own voice, mm-hmm. and has to adopt somebody else's. That's one way of looking at it, certainly. I think that's a valid way of looking at it, and it's certainly true in my case. I didn't think I had anything to write about. or if I did think I had anything to write about, I didn't think that it was that interesting or important. Whereas the life of the Dalai Lama seemed extremely interesting and extremely important, and it was something that I willingly did. So I was setting aside my own, my own voice to the extent that I could, in order to be as faithful as possible to somebody else's.
And how did you navigate the years as a journalist post military? Given that you have this knack for wanting to provide voice to other writers. So, but I imagine for a time, as a reporter and journalist, doing the kind of journalism you were doing at the time, there was an Alexander Norman nature to what you were doing at that time. So, what was that like for you?
Well, I started out writing a few political pieces about defense matters. I think when you're writing doing that kind of work, again, you're not going to have much of a voice, in as much as you're trying to, I suppose, at least what I was doing in my short stint as a freelance defense correspondent for various newspapers like the Spectator, the London Spectator, and the Daily Mail. I was trying to put across a point of view, and I think that sometimes voice, especially in journalism, can get in the way of that point of view. So again, it was a bit of an exercise in suppression. I think in my travel writing that I did during that period, that was more, I was able to develop more of my own voice, if you like. But I certainly don't think that I've ever really succeeded. I mean, it's an ongoing, and I think, some writers will arrive with a voice, ready formed. For others, I think it's a lifelong struggle. I think probably for most. I think, and one has to wonder whether the ones that do arrive with a kind of natural voice, is it really them?
Yeah.
How authentic is it? I'm not sure. I wonder if I could think of any that, I mean, it's often the case. And for example, I mentioned Robert Byron. I would say that his writing is, he's got a voice for sure, but at best, he transcends the mannerisms and the affectations that, as a very young man, he brings to the page. He does, like even in war, he finds it very difficult to write a bad sentence. And that is something I think that very few people are born with, but he was one of them. But that doesn't make up for the infelicities of some of his writing. I mean, I think he's quite gauche. I think he's quite pleased with himself. I think that he's a bit, a bit full of himself. But, he's a great travel writer. There's no question about it. And his very best writing, and some of it can be found in that book, in his book about Tibet, or the half of his book, First Russia, Then Tibet. He turns some wonderful sentences, evokes some genius, or creates some genius descriptions that evoke admiration, not only for his ability as a writer to construct near perfect, beautiful, evocative sentences, but also communicate something about the situation that he's in that seems pretty pitch perfect.
Yeah, that's the fine tightrope to balance between that sort of voice that really kind of pops and makes us want to keep coming back and rereading those sentences versus surrendering to the story a bit. And I think probably a skill that you've cultivated through, this sort of suppression of voice in a way, because you're getting yourself out of the way to let the story elevate. So there's always that fine balance between fireworks and making sure that the story, ultimately the story, stands tallest.
I think that's a very good point. I think it's often the case that the greatest stories are the ones that are the least that are the most universal, if you like. The greatest stories are the ones that transcend the limitations that the writer brings to them. And it's the story itself that carries the reader, and this always works best, of course, when the writer is a master of her or his craft, such as James and Jan Morris. That's someone who is a master prosodist, in my view. And when you get this combination of the two, when you get the story communicated in perfect, limpid prose, such as you'll get in Evelyn Waugh, for example, that is when you see real genius.
Yeah, and what you said about ghostwriting, or what kind of struck me is that it wasn't it wasn't impersonating so much as giving voice to the person who maybe doesn't have, as you were saying, the confidence or probably even the skill to manifest a written story. What's your approach to that? Are you technically speaking, are you recording tape recorder and then trying to distill that in the best way possible in their words, if possible as well? I'd love to hear your mechanics about that.
Yeah, well, two things. One is, sure, I worked with a tape recorder and a notebook, and I recorded hours and hours and hours and hours of conversations, and then I tried to pick out typical words and phrases and try and work them into a text that was authentic. And one of the other things that I did was, for example, when I worked on a book called Ethics for the New Millennium, which was the Dalai Lama's book on a sort of secular ethics, the way that I did that, apart from the hours and hours and hours of interviews, and apart from the reams and reams of notes that I took, I also went to his published works, which 99.9% of which are all simply edited transcripts of public talks or public or private talks that he's given over the years. And I tried to find all those instances where he'd spoken about a particular topic, and I literally would get I would get the book, I would highlight it, I would copy it. I would then have a document which was, say, 10 pages long with maybe, 150 quotations, many of them very, very similar, both in the words that they used and in the constructions, and also the thoughts behind them. But I would then cut them out, having typed them out, I would then cut them out, and then I would try and construct a narrative using these. So effectively, I was literally cutting and pasting. So I was filling in between these sentences. I would provide the connecting thought, if you like. So I was trying as far as possible to use the Dalai Lama's own words and his own constructions, and indeed his own arguments. So my job was really I was a super cutterer and paster, and I tried to be nothing more.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I love paper habits and being real analog about things, especially in a digital age. So that's that real tactile thing, right?
Yeah, it is. It is like that. And I have to say that having done this and having constructed a text, the next thing to do was to go back to the Dalai Lama with the manuscript and go through it with him, line by line, word by word. And it wasn't just me and him, although occasionally it was just the two of us together. But by and large, it was with several other people who were interpreting and helping in translation. I mean, the work was all conducted in English. My spoken Tibetan is not nearly good enough to be able to do this kind of work in Tibetan. So there would be a team of us working, and and as I say, we would go through the text line by line, word by word. It was terrifically good fun, and often hilarious. And we would have not huge, but heated arguments about the use of words or phrases or whatever. And it would often be, though not often, but occasionally it would be that he'd misunderstood the meaning of an English word and was using it in completely the wrong, or even only partly the wrong sense. And I would point this out to him, and then occasionally, one of the other people present would chip in and say, "Oh yes, but have you considered it in this sense?" and so on. And so we would have heated debates about the language that was being used. And he was always for simplicity. He's always trying to cut things down to the least demanding, or the most, perhaps not the least demanding, because often the ideas are quite demanding or very demanding even. But he wants them put across as simply and as directly and as unadorned as possible. He's not a flowery thinker, and he's not a flowery writer, even in Tibetan. So this was part of the discipline, was trying to keep out those little flourishes that, as a writer, one's always as a writer, yes, we have these little flourishes, these little literary sallies that we like to make. So it was often a question of cutting those out. And again, so discipline, suppression, I guess.
Yeah, there's such a surrendering of ego sometimes with the work, because sometimes you feel so proud about, a turn of phrase, but ultimately it's like sometimes the shortest sentences, the leanest words, the tightest words they are the ones that can do the heavy lifting and convey the message in a much more clearer way, which ultimately might not feel as, artistic, but if this is a communicative medium, nothing communicates better than lean language, short sentences, devoid of flourish. And it sounds like that's a great point of connection between you and the Dalai Lama.
Yeah, I think that's right. I always admire what Neil Gaiman once said, the children's writer, Neil Gaiman, British children's writer. He once said that something to the effect that the writer should pay the reader per word, not the other way around.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, the less words that you can use to get the smaller the number of words that you can use to get the idea across, the better or more powerful it will be. And I certainly think there's something in that. On the other hand, there's a huge tension there between that and the kind of, in biography, for example, which is the book that I've just worked on, you're trying to get across a lot of information in a biography that is trying, as mine was, trying to be both readable and to a degree scholarly. You're trying to get over huge amounts of information, and sometimes, short sentences just don't cut it.
Mm-hmm.
You just can't do it in 6 or 8 or 10 words. You might need sentences that are several lines long and paragraphs that are half a page or more. It can't always be done, but it's a good thing, I think, to bear in mind as a writer that economy is your friend, not your enemy.
Yeah, I think, and people I've spoken to and mentors I've had, it's like when the stakes or the drama in a story is the highest is when you need to turn the volume down on the language you use. You don't need to dial it up with language, because the emotive elements and the story elements in place will carry you along. You basically just have to, grease the skids just a little bit, and the story will take care of itself. It's like you don't need to, hammer it home too much. You actually need to show restraint.
I think that's totally true. And I think that comes back to this idea of discipline and suppression of ego. And the better you can do that, often the more effective your writing will be.
And, I'd love to get a sense, I think, in a way, I've kind of buried the lead a bit. I'd love to know how you came to meet the Dalai Lama, roughly 30 years ago. Like, how did that encounter happen?
So how I came first to meet the Dalai Lama is quite simple. I went to interview him for a magazine, a London-based magazine, The Spectator, which is a sort of political, literary, weekly magazine, for which I'd started writing not very long before. But how that actually came about is a slightly longer story, which begins, funnily enough, well, I guess my fascination with Tibet began with when I was very young. I came across a book called 7 Years in Tibet by Heinrich Harrer, who was this German, well, actually Austrian adventurer who met the Dalai Lama during the 1940s, having escaped from a British prison camp in India, and whom I subsequently got to know many years later in the 90s. But he'd written this amazing book called 7 Years in Tibet, which, as you may know, was turned into a film by Brad Pitt, or starring Brad Pitt. So that was my first encounter with Tibet. But then in my teen years, I came across a series of books which I found totally captivating and beguiling. And they were a series of books written by somebody by the name of Lobsang Rampa. The thing is that when I was a kid growing up, we didn't have Harry Potter. But J.K. Rowling's genius was to see that every boy, every growing boy, and presumably every growing girl would like to be a wizard and would like to make magic happen. And the thing about Lobsang Rampa was that he purported to have experience of learning the magical arts in Tibet. And he wrote this series of books, starting with a book called The Third Eye, which was a massive bestseller in the early 1950s and was immediately denounced by Tibetan scholars of the day, in which he purported to be a Tibetan monk who at a young age had been chosen for a career of magic and prophecy and communicating with the astral plane. Anyway, to me, these books were absolutely, enthralling. I think I realized about halfway through the second one that I was being spun a yarn, but it didn't matter. They were just charming and captivating stories that had me enthralled. And many people that you find who, not many, but perhaps not so many today, but certainly 20 years ago, a lot of the people who you would meet in Tibetan circles, even in Tibetan scholarly circles, would have been brought into the fold by their reading of Lobsang Rampa. Lobsang Rampa, in fact, turned out to be a prosthetic salesman from the southwest of England who impersonated or claimed to have had an encounter with a Tibetan Lama and to have been the subject of a Tibetan practice known as Poa. Poa is the transference of consciousness from one living being into another. So Lobsang Rampa, he claimed to have had an accident climbing a tree and to have had this encounter following this accident with a Tibetan Lama. And he agreed to give up his body to the Tibetan Lama, who then transferred his consciousness. And he began writing these books as Lobsang Rampa. So I was completely captivated by these. And so there were those two influences, I suppose, early influences on me. 7 Years in Tibet, the stirring adventure story of Heinrich Harrer, and the sort of mystical beguilements of Lobsang Rampa, which came together when just after I'd left the army, actually, I met with my godfather, who himself was an army officer and was the British recruiting officer of the Gurkha regiment. I don't know if you know about the Gurkhas, but the Gurkhas are a brigade, in fact, of soldiers recruited exclusively from the highlands, the uplands of Nepal. And the British Army still has several thousand of these Gurkhas under arms. And the Indian Army has tens of thousands of them to this day. Anyway, my godfather was a recruiting officer for them, which meant that he spent a lot of time in Nepal, and he would interview and assess these young, likely lads who wanted to be members of the British Army or badged into the British Army as Gurkhas. Anyway, to cut a long story short, I bumped into him, and he said to me, "Oh, what are you doing these days, Alexander?" And I said, "Oh, not a lot, this and that, writing a bit." He said, "Oh, well, why don't you come and see me in Nepal?" I said, "Well, yeah, why not? I'd love to do that." So I went off to see him, and it was whilst there that I first encountered some Tibetan monks, and I had the idea of trying to get an interview with the Dalai Lama, who at the time was a completely unknown character. I mean, he was very little written about in the Western press in those days, and people who were interested in him were tended to be people who were interested in Buddhism rather than in the politics of Tibet. That all changed, of course, with the Nobel Prize in 1990. But prior to that, the Dalai Lama was very little known and very little understood. I would argue that today he's extremely well known, but still very little understood. And that's one of the things that I've tried to do in my biography, which is to provide, if you like, a third dimension. It seems to me that a lot of what is written about the Dalai Lama and a lot of what is thought to be known about him is very two-dimensional and doesn't really tell you very much about him, what he believes, and what he's done. So I've tried to show that, in my view, the Dalai Lama is far more interesting than most people even begin to realize. He's had a life such as practically no human being alive on this planet today has had anything like as astonishing a life story as the Dalai Lama. I mean, it is one of the great lives of the last 100 years, without question. I mean, you know, he's up there with Winston Churchill or, I don't know, who would you want to say? His is a great life, an astonishing life, an extraordinary life. And that is something that have been fascinated with for the 30 years that I've known him, and for the 20 years that I knew about him before I knew him, if you see what I mean.
Mm. What was it like for you making the transition of being a co-writer with him early on, and then essentially stepping over the line to be more of an independent biographer of him for this latest book? Yeah, what was that like for you, and how did you navigate, those two poles of the story?
Yeah. Well, I suppose I had a practice run with a book called, which was published in the States as Secret Lives of the Dalai Lama, the Untold Stories of the Men Who Shaped the History of Tibet. A rather long and verbose title, and in fact, I think I even gave it to you wrong. But anyway, Secret Lives of the Dalai Lama is what it was published as, and it was published in Britain as Holder of the White Lotus. And this is a history of the institution of the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama, the present Dalai Lama, is the 14th. He's the 14th incarnation in a lineage that stretches back to the end of the 14th century. The first Dalai Lama, Ghoswriting, was born in 1391. But he, in turn, traces, or his lineage, as it's called, can be traced back through historical figures at least until the 7th century. And then a sort of series of apocryphal lives right back to the time of the Buddha. And he, in turn, the one who first manifested on Earth during the time of the Buddha, is said to have had an incarnation 900 eons ago, before the life of the Buddha. So the idea is that it's a very, very long and well-attested historical lineage. So my book was to try and, obviously didn't go back to to prehistory, but I went back to, I traced the lineage back to 2,500 years ago, the time of the Buddha, these early apocryphal lives. And then I picked up the story in the 7th century, and it was a straightforward run, if you like, through these various incarnations, bringing the story up to the present day. So that was my dry run, if you like. It wasn't a biography; it was, if you like, a series of biographies that were enfolded into a narrative history of Tibet. That's what it amounted to, and I was able to weave kind of hagiographical anecdote with historical material, with, in many cases, well, indeed, in each case, in the case of all the Dalai Lama's incarnations in Tibet, and then right back to the 7th century, there are well-attested primary sources that can be consulted. So we get a very good picture of the history of Tibet through this. So I would say that this work was first and foremost a history into which were enfolded these mini biographies of the different incarnations. So that was my dry run. So the question of how I negotiated the transition from ghostwriter to biographer, I didn't find too hard, to be honest. But I suppose when you're writing a biography, of course, there are lots of ways of writing a biography, but the way that I chose to write it was to try and let, again, other voices do most of the work. I didn't want to rely on my own encounters with the Dalai Lama. After all, I've only known him for less than half his life, but I didn't want that to come into it. I think that would be, that could possibly be the subject of some other piece of work. But what I was trying to do in this book was to, again, give voices to other sources, not just, what am I saying? I was trying to give voices to other people who'd encountered him over the years, over the decades. Starting with, for example, there was a great American journalist called, and here, of course, I can't remember what his name was, Archibald Steele of the Chicago Daily News, was the first Western journalist to encounter, indeed the first Westerner to encounter the Dalai Lama in Kumbum Monastery in 1939, I think it was. Oh, wow. And his are the first known photographs of the Dalai Lama.
He would have been about 2 years old at the time, right?
That's right. He had just been placed in the monastery by his parents and was not yet acknowledged as the Dalai Lama, although it was being openly spoken of him that he seemed a highly likely candidate, a highly plausible candidate. So Steele comes along there and photographs this child prodigy and writes about him, and then subsequently met him about 12 years later when he went to Tibet proper, again on assignment from the Chicago Daily News. And after he died in the 90s, as I recall, his widow put together a biography of Steele, and he presents this wonderful picture of Tibet in the in the late 30s, early 40s. So I was able to use sources like this, which are very little known outside Tibetan circles, or, the very narrow circle of Tibetan, non-Tibetan historians, and was able to weave these into the narrative. So yeah, recovering a lot of voices that might otherwise have been forgotten, and that's one of the joys, I think, of writing, of doing this sort of work. You get these little nuggets, you get these little little snippets, little evocations of the past that that seem completely authentic and are completely perfect in their way. They capture the atmosphere in a way that that the sort of more the kind of chronicles of the time just can't do. The same is true if you think there was when the Dalai Lama went to Tibet, not to Tibet, when the Dalai Lama went to India in the early 1950s, he was appointed as his liaison officer, his political liaison officer, a Cambridge-educated Indian official who was in fact Parsi, a Zoroastrian, who writes wonderfully about how people reacted to him, both Tibetans and Indians, and how the mass adulation of people, and how there's this wonderful scene where he's riding in a car with actually the Panchen Lama, who was accompanying the Dalai Lama, but it could have been the Dalai Lama. It didn't matter. The point was that the enthusiasm of the people for him imperiled the safety of their car. They were wanting to. They practically turned it over. The press of the crowd was so wild and so insistent. And there were so many thousands of people, and things came whizzing in through the window, and you just get this sense of unbridled joy as the Dalai Lama comes into India for the first time. So yeah, it's wonderful to give voice to these people, these otherwise forgotten people.
What struck me about the story as well was the relationship between Tibet and the Dalai Lama going back, 14 incarnations, and the relationship to violence too. It's a very violent history that's tethered to the Dalai Lama going back centuries. That struck me. That surprised me.
Yeah, well, I think it will surprise most people. After all, our image of Tibet is of a Pacific kind of Shangri-La kind of. We think of monks meditating in the mountains and the serenity and the natural beauty and harmony of the country.
Yeah, Facebook image of Tibet, as you say in the afterword.
Yeah, the Facebook image of Tibet. The Tibet of historical record is very, very different. And I think this is one of the most interesting things about the Dalai Lama is the way that he has been associated. I wouldn't say that he's associated himself, because I think this all happens around him, but the way that he's become associated with an idea of Tibet, which is so far from the reality as to bear almost no resemblance whatsoever. It's remarkable, and I haven't really gone into it too much in the book, but what lies behind this is an important question. How on earth is it that we've persuaded ourselves that Tibet, and indeed Buddhism itself, is this wonderful ironic religion, or this harmonious place, when the facts are so widely different. On the other hand, I do make the point that, whilst it's extremely shocking to learn, for example, that when the Dalai Lama was a child, one of the government cabinet ministers had his eyes put out for treason, or that the Dalai Lama's regent was murdered by poisoning, or indeed that the Dalai Lama's own father seems to have almost certainly been assassinated. Or much more recently, in the late 90s, one of his closest associates was horribly murdered in exile in India. These deeply shocking incidents. And yet, from the Tibetan perspective, nobody's going to turn around and deny them or say that they weren't shocking. But they will say that, well, these are isolated incidents, and that's one of the challenges, or one of the, I don't know, challenges is probably the wrong word, but this is one of the dangers, I think, of history and biography. Because after all, when you write a biography or you're writing a piece of history, you're telling a story. You're trying to say, what this person did on such and such an occasion, and to some extent what that person is like, and what that person may have meant by what they said or did. Or if you're writing a piece of history, you're trying to say, well, this happened and that happened, and the reason that this happened was because of this and this and this, and the consequence of that happening was X, Y, and Z. But in order to do this in an interesting way, something that captivates the reader, obviously you're going to have to highlight, the most colourful incidents. You're going to be using the anecdotes that are most you're going to use the brightest colours. You're not going to use the drab and the grey. You're going to go for the spectacular sunsets. If that's not mixing the metaphor too far. So you can easily give the impression that, life in Tibet was one long series of horrendous incidents in which people suffered terribly. And this is certainly the Chinese narrative. This is exactly what the Chinese will tell you, that pre-liberation Tibet was a hell for the common man and woman, of course. But that would be ridiculous. There's absolutely no evidence of that whatsoever. But the danger is that in writing, in trying to portray these sunsets and all their vivid colors, you actually overlook the fact that most of the time people did indeed live, largely contented lives, even if the system is not one that we might choose for ourselves today. It is a difficulty, and I acknowledge that. And certainly in the life story of the Dalai Lama, I've picked out those incidents that are the most, that will be of most interest to the reader. I mean, a narrative is sustained by not only by the drive, from the beginning to the end of the narrative, but also the incidents and the little aperçus and the little snapshots that we get along the way. Those are what keep you wondering. That's what gets the reader turning the page, one hopes. So, for example, I put in the incident when Allen Ginsberg visits the Dalai Lama in early 1962. Now, in the life of the Dalai Lama, that's barely worth a footnote in a way. I mean, it certainly didn't make any difference to the Dalai Lama. But it made a big difference to Allen Ginsberg, and indeed it tells us something about, I guess, something about the beats, perhaps. So in the incident, we've got Ginsberg and Joanne Kiger and Gary Snyder and Peter Orlovsky, who was Ginsberg's lover at the time, going to Tibet and having an interview with the Dalai Lama. And Joanne Kiger writes about it in her journal, which is published 30 years later. And you get this picture of Ginsberg asking the Dalai Lama whether he'd like to try some of his magic mushrooms, and Snyder arguing with the Dalai Lama and telling him to shut up because he's just being boring. And so to me, this is a hilarious and magnificent incident that deserves to be wider known. But in the context of the Dalai Lama's own personal life, Well, it means practically nothing. It was just a bunch of hippies who'd come to see him, and it took up 20 minutes, half an hour of his time, and I dare say that he forgot about it almost immediately. So you have this disparity between the importance of the event on the life of the individual who you're writing about and the importance of the event or the way that this event illuminates an aspect of Tibetan culture, for example, and Western culture. You've got this collision. You've got this collision between the kind of the hippie quest for spiritual. Well, we could call it the hippie, but actually, what we're really talking about is the human quest for spiritual nourishment, which the Beats are the first to, perhaps, or among the first to, take to the East. So one gets the sense that these are individuals who come from a society, from a culture which is tired. It's tired. It's tired of its own spiritual heritage, if you like, and it's looking for some other source of spiritual nourishment. And, the fact that, you could argue that many of the people who went on this quest were a bunch of wackos. Clearly many of them weren't. Many of them were had very sincere and noble motives. But you do get this clash, and it's illuminating on both sides. I think it shows us. It shows us on the one hand, it shows us something about the Tibetan cultural tradition, and it shows us how the West itself has been changed by this older tradition. I mean, I think one of the things that I claim in my book is that the Dalai Lama's influence has been far greater than we ordinarily acknowledge. And politically, as he often says, his life has been a failure. He's tried to negotiate a rapprochement between the Tibetan people and the Chinese, and that's completely failed. Tibet is no more independent today than it was when he left over 60 years ago. But on the other hand, the world has been changed by its encounter with the Dalai Lama, in my view. The very word compassion, for example, with which he's so closely identified, has come to mean so much more in the last 50 years. And it's impossible, I think, to imagine this happening without the Dalai Lama, without his not only his advocacy of compassion, but also his explication of Buddhism in terms of compassion. And I think that the Dalai Lama has been at the forefront of the encounter between Buddhism and the Western world. And I think it's had a massive impact. Starting with the huge numbers of people who have joined the Buddhist centers that have grown exponentially throughout the Western world in the last half century, but also, the mindfulness movement, which must encompass millions and millions of people, and it has a trickle-down effect. We see it in education. We see kids, I don't know about so much in the States, but certainly in Europe, we have a considerable openness now towards the Eastern traditions, and I'm sure it's the same in America too, of course it is, an openness towards the Eastern traditions that was unimaginable 50 years ago. And I think throughout this, the Dalai Lama has been at the forefront. He has been, and certainly for the last 30 years, since he came to the attention of the West following his award of the Nobel Peace Prize, he's been at the forefront of that movement. So I think his influence has been very considerable indeed.
Mm-hmm. As I opened up just a Chrome tab, it's just kind of a weird coincidence, if you will. And I get these quotes that pop up, And today was actually a quote from the Buddha, and it was like, all right, well, that's kind of tangentially related to what we're talking about today. And the quote was, you know well what leads you forward and what holds you back, and choose the path that leads you to wisdom. And, speaking to what you just said about human quest for symbolic nourishment, and, given what we've spoken about in terms of your writing and your life, and of course this biography you've written, I'd extend to you maybe, what, these days, what leads you forward, maybe with your work or your life, what leads you forward and what do you feel holds you back?
Interesting question. What leads me forward? I suppose one of the things that I take from my whole encounter with the Dalai Lama, with Tibetan culture, and my experience with many Tibetan friends over the last 3 decades, is the way to which we misconstrue reality. And I think this is at the heart of Buddhism itself, is the claim that we completely don't get it right. We completely get it wrong, in fact. It's not at all as it looks. And I think that's true in what I call the Facebook image of Tibet. It absolutely isn't the case that people in Tibet were uniquely peaceful. They lived a uniquely harmonious life, that the monks were uniquely pacific and diligent meditators. In fact, they were some of the most determined resistors to the Chinese military takeover of Tibet in the 1950s. I mean, it's the monks themselves who provide the frontline troops, and by that I mean armed with rifles.
Yeah.
We go out. We see them go out. And hook up with these agents trained by the CIA in Virginia in the States, and indeed many of the CIA agents trained by the Americans were ex-monks. So it's completely not the case that Buddhism is a uniquely peaceful religion. Mm-hmm. We've got that completely wrong. But you could just stop there. You could say, oh, well, then Buddhism is like every other religion. And in some ways, that's certainly true. No religion, actually, every religion claims to be a religion of peace. But when we dig a little deeper, we find that's very far from the case. But does that mean to say that, therefore religion is a bad idea? No, I don't think it does I don't think it does, I don't think that's a valid argument, because you only have to look at what happens when you take religion out of the picture, So, consider Mao's China or Pol Pot's Cambodia or Hitler's Germany or Stalin's Russia. The results are not so much better, are they? So I'm drawn forward. What I'm actually working on at the moment is a novel in which I try to create a world which on the surface of it seems to be one thing, but actually turns out to be another, and how the central character navigates this gradual realization. So I suppose that what draws me forward is this sense that, the Dalai Lama's right. The world is not as it seems. And what holds me back? I suppose one of the things that holds me back is the danger that is attendant on this this view. I mean, one of the big difficulties that I encountered writing this book was writing about the violence, the unsettling amount of violence that we do encounter in the history of Tibet, right up to the present day. And I've often wondered, oh my goodness, shoot the messenger. This is bad news. So I think lack of courage might be one of the things that would hold me back. You know, do you really want to be the purveyor of bad news? Or do you dare be the purveyor of bad news if you're telling people that things are not quite as they thought they were? On the other hand, as I say, it's a question of you got to get beyond the bad news. You've got to see that, in my view, in the case of Tibet and the Dalai Lama, for example, that the bad news of him, for example, being well aware that the Tibetan resistance movement was being supported by the CIA throughout the late 50s and early 60s. And he certainly did nothing to hinder that operation, which perhaps you might have expected him to do. In a way, that's bad news. That tells us that perhaps the Dalai Lama isn't quite as otherworldly as we might like to believe. But on the other hand, in my view, we need to go beyond that recognition that, so the Dalai Lama was, if not involved, certainly implicated in certain historical events that we might prefer him not to have been implicated in. Another case in point is Indira Gandhi's dirty war in Bangladesh in 1971. So you've got this absolutely frightful juxtaposition of George Harrison's concert for Bangladesh in Madison Square Garden in November 1971 at almost exactly the same time as the Dalai Lama is giving his permission to General S.S. Uban, the Indian Special Forces general, to use Tibetan troops in what effectively was a dirty war on India's eastern border in what was then East Pakistan and subsequently became Bangladesh. So you've got this terribly ironic situation where the Dalai Lama is placed in an impossible position, it has to be said, by the Indian Prime Minister. And he really has nothing, he's got no option in one way. But on the other hand, you might argue, well, if the Dalai Lama was really this man of total peace, then he would have stood up and he would have said, "Over my dead body." And one might think that somebody like Mahatma Gandhi might have done that, might have said, if the tanks roll, they've got to roll over me before they get to the enemy, sort of thing. And I think that, it would be foolish just to stop at that question of perhaps, no, let me rephrase that. I think that it would be, we have to try to think beyond the events themselves. We have to try to put them in context. We have to understand the tradition. We have to understand the culture. We have to understand how this could be. How could it be that the Dalai Lama acquiesced in these military operations? And the answer to the question is, well, he is, if you like, the epitome, the apotheosis of the Tibetan cultural tradition. Let's look at that cultural tradition. Let's see what it says. Let's see what it tells him to do. Let's see what it expects of him. And I think that's where you have your answer. And the answer is that the Dalai Lama, as a Buddhist, is committed to the view that ultimately the world is a world of illusion. The world is no more substantial than the reflection of the moon in a puddle of water. He's committed to that view. Now, if that's correct, if he's correct in that view, then things like whether Tibetan troops do or do not go into Bangladesh, whether or not the CIA supports Tibetan troops, or whether the CIA does not support the Tibetan resistance, is a matter for them. It's not a matter for him. So long as the individual practitioner himself or herself is not consciously involved in in an action that results in violence, then that individual doesn't bear doesn't create the negative karma that accrued to such an action. So the Tibetan tradition, the Tibetan cultural tradition, doesn't demand that the Dalai Lama, for example, I don't know, when the Chinese come into Tibet, it doesn't demand that he become like Custer. He's not the man, he's not last man standing. It is absolutely right from the perspective of the Tibetan tradition that the Dalai Lama withdraws. He withdraws from conflict. He doesn't engage in conflict. He may on occasions acquiesce in it, but he does not engage in it. And I think this is what we have to take away. We have to understand that these seeming paradoxes these ironies that come up in history are not what they seem. The claim that the Dalai Lama, for example, as the Chinese would say, he's a wolf in monk's robes. These just as if I tell you, yes, the Dalai Lama's Lord Chamberlain was the CIA's link man in Tibet during the 1950s. I mean, that seems quite shocking. But if you then place it in context, if we look at it in the round, we begin to understand. Similarly, when we learn that the Dalai Lama did not oppose his brothers, who were determined to call on American help for violent resistance against the Chinese in the 1950s. He didn't oppose them. There are different ways of looking at this. You could take the view that he was approving it by not disapproving of it, or you could take the view that he was simply not engaging in it. And that is what the tradition expects, that he doesn't engage. And it's a subtle but important difference between condoning by not disapproving and simply not engaging, which is actually what he was doing.
Mm. Well, it's. I think we could talk for 5 hours about what you've written here, because it's dense and rich and nuanced with tons of shades of gray, and I think you've accomplished something masterful here with a big Titanic project. So it's thank you for the work, Alexander. And where can people maybe find you online and find a way to find you on the internet and get more familiar with your work in the book?
Well, actually, the truth of the matter is I'm practically invisible online, although my children are trying to persuade me to do something about that. So maybe there will be a homepage one of these days. But no, I would just I would ask readers to look. I think people wanting to know more about the Dalai Lama, yes. Of course, I'd be delighted if they read my biography, but they should also read the Dalai Lama's autobiography. And in fact, he wrote 2 autobiographies, and they're both very worthwhile.
We did it. We made it, CNFers. Thank you so much for listening. Be sure you're subscribing to the show, of course. This crazy show is produced by me, Brendan O'Mara. Hey. I make this show for you. I hope it made something worth sharing. And if you really dig the show, leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Show notes are at BrendanO'Mara.com. Follow the show on the various social media channels at CNFPod across them all. Get that newsletter at my website. Win books, win zines, hang out with your buddy B.O. Once a month, no spam, can't beat it. Are we done here? We must. Because if you can do, interview. See ya!